The book of Numbers, then. All right, here we go. So it's in some ways, let me just start with this. And I hope this is really encouraging for you. We start reading the book of Numbers next weekend in our Bible read through. And let me say, it is one of the easiest books of the Bible to make sense of. All right. And the reason is we're actually told in the Bible what to do with the book of Numbers. All right. So when the Apostle Paul is writing to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he's talking about the Old Testament church. And he says this, they all ate the same spiritual food and they drank the same spiritual drink. They drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So he's got in mind the book of Numbers. And then this is what Paul says. These things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. All right. We should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes. Again, all stuff from Numbers. Do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angels. These things, all things from Numbers, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. All right, so straight away we're told this is what the book of Numbers is about. This is how to read it. And it's not just Paul. You get John and Peter and Jude all draw explicitly on the book of Numbers as warning us about things that can go wrong in the life of the church as we journey with Christ through the wilderness of this age. All right, so the apostles see the book of Numbers and teach from the book of Numbers as if it was designed to provide examples for us of how to be the people of God and how not to be the people of God. All right, to warn us about the mistakes that the church can make as they journey with Christ. And I think one of the things to grasp is that actually we still struggle with the same issues that we see the very first generation of the church struggling with. This first generation that are brought out through the Exodus. There are these systemic issues that are born out of our fallenness, which threaten the church's relationship with God and that threaten the church's usefulness to God in every generation. All right. And that's what the book of Numbers is there to help us to make sense of and to diagnose. Yeah. So there's this weird thing as you get into the book of Numbers. At one level, it's a really easy book to read. It's really easy to know what the book is about, to know how to make sense of it. But actually, it's an incredibly challenging book to read as well, because it's a book that is designed to point out the mistakes that the church can make. And it calls us on the mistakes that we make and the patterns of sin that we can so easily just accept as normal. Like, this is just normal, right? But actually, Numbers is saying, no, that's not normal. Those patterns of behavior are sinful. They're like cancers in the body of Christ, destroying the church, which can actually make it a really uncomfortable book to engage with in a really kind of meaningful way. But if we can take that, as it were, if we can feel the force of that, then actually Numbers has a lot to teach us about how to be the church, how to be the people who are in relationship with the living God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, because Numbers is the story of how God takes this kind of bunch of people from loads of different backgrounds and cultures and nations and builds them into being his people. All right, what you got to realize is the Exodus was this public phenomenon. It was colossal in terms of kind of global events at the time, and it was really self-consciously and deliberately acted out in front of the nations of the world, so that the nations of the world could see what God was doing through the Exodus. And people from those nations, they saw this, and there were people who were drawn into what was happening at the Exodus, right, all the way through the Old Testament, right? The nations are invited to come and be a part of what the Lord is doing in Israel. And again, and even in Numbers, you see people from the nations responding to that invitation and coming and being a part of the church. All right. And it's over and over again in books like Numbers, you'll hear it stressed that the same laws, all right, they apply in the same way, whether you are ethnically a descendant of Abraham or whether you are someone who has joined the church from another nation, become a part of the ancient church. Everybody is on a level playing field before God. All right. So that's the kind of context in which the book of Numbers is being written into. And the question is, what does this post-Exodus life, what does life in the church look like? All right, you've got this radically different way of being people, of being community. All right, it's so different from anything that anyone has ever seen anywhere else in the world. All right, and in many ways, it's directly opposed to the life that many people will have experienced in their own nations before they come to be a part of the holy nation that is the people of God. And it's like, how do you do this? We could never work out for ourselves what it would be like to be the church, what it would be like to be God's people. And so what you have in the book of Numbers is you've got this like this first generation of what you might think of as the institutional church, right? You've got this first generation who just come through the Exodus, and God is like, he's like popping the bonnet on church life. And he's saying, right, let's get into the deep workings of how to be my people. Let me teach you what it means to be people in relationship with me. And that's the kind of question the book of Numbers is wrestling with. How do we relate to God? How does God relate to us? How do we relate to one another as the people of God? How do we relate to the world? How do we relate to our future hope in the new creation? You know, how do we relate to sin when it's in the life of the church? Like, what temptations do we face from inside and from outside the life of the church? And what do we do when we face those temptations together? How do we organize church life together? What does church leadership look like? All right. When does somebody become a member of the church? And when they do become a member of the church, what rights and responsibilities do they have because they are members of the church? All right. And how do you connect things like fellowship and mission and worship? All right. That's what Numbers is all about. And there's a sense in which it's harder to find in the Bible a more immediately practical and relevant book than the book of Numbers. All right. So there's a lot here for us to learn. And we're just going to jump straight into it. And I'm going to try to give you a way of reading the book that will hopefully make a bit of sense for you. All right. Now, Numbers, there's a massive division at chapter 26. Okay, that's the red line in the book to look for. Chapter 26, and we'll look a bit at the second half of the book later on this morning. All right, but in the first section of the book, okay, we're dealing with the first generation of the church, the people who've literally been brought out from the Exodus. And what you will find in this first section of the book, right up through to chapter 26, is there's a cycle that just keeps repeating, which kind of tells you something straight away, yeah? But the first part of the cycle of the church's experience of their relationship with God, all right? And the church is kind of camped somewhere, and God teaches them, all right? He teaches them about different aspects of what it means to be his people, yeah? And then the second part of the cycle is, and again, and sometimes this is linked with a period of travel between camps. All right, not always, but sometimes. The second part of the cycle is, how do the people respond to what they've just been taught? Yeah, will they put it into practice? Do they rebel? Do they kind of think, oh, man, we've got a better way of doing this? Or will they trust the angel of the Lord who is in their midst? All right, and very often, the church's response to what the Lord has taught them is very, very ambiguous. You know, there's a real unwillingness on the part of the church to be the people, to do what God tells them to do. And they've got their own agendas and their own ideas, and they don't want to accept God's vision for their lives. And it's really tragic, and it's really easy to read those sections of the book and to think, guys, how could you be so stupid? You've experienced so much of God and his grace. He's like there. The manifest glory of God is right there at the tabernacle in the center of your camp. Surely when you've experienced so much of God's grace, there should be this massive response of devotion and trust and obedience. But actually, that's what makes, I think, the book so valuable for us, is because they don't always respond like that. Often they respond in ways that are rebellious and sinful. And actually, that's what makes the book partly so uncomfortable for us to read, but actually so valuable for us to read. Because what we will see is that their response is in so many ways like an echo of our own response, which is so often ambiguous to the extraordinary grace that we have been shown. All right, so the first part of the cycle, God teaches them. The second part of the cycle is their response to that. And the third part of the cycle then is God engaging with them on the basis of their response. See, the book of Numbers, it's relationally, it's a really dynamic book. The people are responding to God, and then God is responding to and engaging with them on the basis of that response. All right. And so when you're reading those parts of the book, you need to be asking yourself, like, where is the Lord disciplining the church? And where is their grace in that? And where is their provision? Or where is he reiterating and reminding them of what he's just taught them in the first part of that cycle? Where is he pruning or refining the church? Is there rebuke here, or is there encouragement? All right. Is there something that happens in God's response to them that points them back to their hope in the Messiah and in the new creation? All right. Those are the kinds of questions that you need to have in mind as you read through those sections of the book. And it's hard because it's so easy to be so focused on where God is disciplining the church for their disobedience that you miss where he is being gracious and continuing to provide for them and teaching them and calling them back into relationship with himself. So just make sure you're really disciplined about picking out the full spectrum of God's response to his people. All right, now the first time this cycle plays out, at the start of the book of Numbers, right, the church is still at Sinai. All right, so it's been just over a year since the Exodus. And during that year, they've been building the tabernacle. They've been starting to figure out what it means to be the people of God. They're learning how to worship. They're hearing the law. They're building that into their lives. There's a lot of stuff that's new, and they're just getting used to not being slaves in Egypt anymore. All right, they're just getting used to this idea that they are the people of God now. And it's like God's given them this year to adjust and to overcome the shock and to recover from the trauma of the Exodus. All right. But the problem is God hasn't redeemed them just to stay at Sinai. All right. And this is a big deal in Numbers. All right. God has redeemed them in order to bring them into this land that will symbolize the new creation. This land where God will live with them, where they are going to be his people. They're going to live their life in accordance with his vision for what human life and society and culture should be like. All right. That's the whole point. And the nations are going to look in on that, and they're going to be amazed, and they're going to be like, yeah, we want to be a part of that kind of life. All right. And so it's this massively evangelistic thing that's going on that God is wanting to draw them into through the book of Numbers. So Israel can't stay at Sinai, camped out in the wilderness. All right. It has to get moving. And there's a number of things that happen in this. And this is really chapters 1 to 10. And we'll do this section, and then we'll have a break, chance to kind of fill up coffee cups and stuff like that. So chapters 1 to 10. All right, this is the people of God. They're getting ready to start the journey to the promised land now. And the first thing that happens is that the people are numbered. All right, that's where the book gets its name from. This numbering of the people of God. But it's not just a census. Yeah, the numbering thing is important. We'll see that when we hit chapter 26 after the break. But there's a lot more going on than just counting how many people there are. So let me try and lay some of that out for you. The first thing to realize is that the church is not a formless, chaotic mass of statistics. All right. People are named in these opening chapters of Numbers. They're given roles and responsibilities that they have to fulfill if the church is going to function well and efficiently. Right? What you get in these opening chapters is a sense that everyone in the church matters. Everyone is involved. Everyone is contributing. All right. It's so easy, I think, for us to kind of resign ourselves to what's sometimes called the 80-20 rule, where, 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. Right? When you read the book of Numbers, you realize that is deeply unchristian. It's profoundly anti-Christian to allow that to be the way that we function as a church. All right. Authentic church life sees everyone involved and everyone contributing. All right. There's a really great example of this in Numbers chapter 7, where over 12 days, each of the 12 tribes brings their contributions to the work of the tabernacle. And it's all right. And everybody, they all bring the same stuff, but it's all listed out. On the first day, this tribe came and they brought this. The second day, this tribe came and they brought this. And actually, it's quite a boring chapter to read in some ways, because it's just this repetition of what all the tribes bring, and it's all the same. But the point that's being made is really simple, that, any one of the tribes could have just foot the bill for the tabernacle, right? No problem. But the point is they didn't. All right. Every tribe is bringing its contribution, and every contribution counts. Everyone has a stake in and is involved in supporting the worship of the church. All right. And let me say this as well, just in passing. Numbers is a great book to celebrate the administrators and the organizers and the logisticians and the managers of the church, the people who take care of finances and physical resources and rotas and things like that. Okay, you get a real sense in Numbers just how crucial those roles are within the life of the church. If you're a details person, you love the book of Numbers, all right, because it's about the detail. It's about the specific. The big picture is, yeah, we're going to the promised land. Numbers is about, okay, but how's that going to work? How are we going to get there? All right, what's going to happen? All right, there's a lot of that in chapters 1 to 10. All right. But something else that's really interesting is that people don't get to camp just wherever they like. And they don't get to camp with whoever they like. They can't be like, oh, well, I really like you, so can we camp out together at the next section, right? That doesn't happen in the book of Numbers, right? Everyone is given a place in the life of the church, and they're part of a much bigger picture. There's this amazing section in the book of Numbers that explains and talks about how the camp is laid out in the shape of a cross with the tabernacle at its center. All right. And the Levites camped around the tabernacle, and then the camps kind of spread out like the four arms of the cross. And everyone camps under one of these four standards, flags. And one of them's a lion, one of them's an ox, and one of them's a man, and one of them's an eagle. And we're like, man, we've seen that before. That's the four faces of the cherubim, isn't it? And so when you read in Psalm 34, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. And you're looking at what's going on in Numbers, and that just takes on a whole new level of meaning and significance, right? But each of those standards has 3 tribes, and then the tribes are broken down into clans and family units, and we're told how they all relate to one another, and the order that they're going to break camp in, and the order that they're going to travel in. All right. And, it's kind of 1 Corinthians 14 stuff. God is not a God of disorder. Details, the specifics of how things are done matter to God. All right. And when you start Numbers next week, watch out for how structures of leadership are built into the life of the church. All right. I'm not going to get into this massively this morning, but it is worth a whole study in itself, because leadership in the book of Numbers is really sophisticated. There are certain aspects of leadership that kind of get delegated out from the center, as it were, into, it cascades through the life of the church. But then there are other aspects of leadership that are massively centralized and focused in on actually a very small group of people. And one of the things we'll see is if you try and mess with those dynamics of leadership, bad things happen in the book of Numbers. All right. So, there's leadership, there's worship. Okay. The guiding principles of worship are laid down, and everyone is shown how they connect to and how they participate in the worshiping life of the church. There's a lot of stuff that's going on here that's echoing and building on Leviticus. I don't want to go over stuff we've already done, but there's this big deal in Numbers about the tribe of Levi and how that Levi relates to the rest of Israel. And there's a really powerful thing that goes on about how every family has a representative Levite. Yeah, so there's this kind of correspondence between the number of Levites and the number of families. And every family has the Levite who stands in their place, and because of whom their firstborn, if you like, is redeemed. And there are these lines that run through the life of the church and that focus in on the ministry and the work of the high priest. And a massive deal, the high priest, massive in the book of Numbers. There's this one moment, right? And it's brilliant, where all the people, the whole camp, lay their hands on the Levites. So every family lays their hands on their representative Levite. And then all those Levites go in and they lay their hands on the sacrifice. All right. And then the high priest offers that sacrifice. And it's such a powerful visual way of seeing how kind of when the high priest makes atonement, he's making atonement for all the sins of the church. Everybody's sin is kind of passed through their Levite and borne by the sacrifice. It's amazing stuff that's going on there. Okay. But you begin to realize as you go through Numbers as well, that actually worship, when the church is at worship, it's not just about us expressing our devotion to the Lord, right? That there are ways of doing that in the book of Numbers, and there are ways of doing that built into the church's experience of worship. But actually, worship is much more about the Lord teaching the church about himself and how he relates to us, and therefore how we can relate to him. All right, so yeah, this is the whole thing about how the church is worship. When we're worshiping, we are learning about who God is, as well as expressing our response to that vision of God. All right, and one of the things that we learn about the high priest in Numbers is that the only way we can deal with God, the only way we can learn about God, and the only way we can approach God and relate to God is through the high priest, his appointed high priest, his chosen high priest. Everything focuses in on the high priest. And if you try to get to God around or outside of the ministry of the high priest, there's only death in the book of Numbers. And you see it over and over again, how this is all pointing us to the person and the work of Jesus. All right, so the last thing you really get focused in on in this opening section of Numbers, chapters 1 to 10, is the principles of fellowship. It's not just about how do we relate to God, it's about how do we relate to one another within the life of the church. How do relationships work? How does our fellowship interplay with our worship? That's a really interesting question to watch out for as you go through Numbers over the next few weeks. And the connections that there are between our personal life and our corporate life. All right. And how our personal life, there's a sense in which our personal lives aren't private lives in the church. What we do in the privacy of our own life, as it were, affects our life together as the people of God. All right, watch for that as you go through Numbers. What people do in their tents affects the whole camp. And the question of how we deal with sin and the damage that individual sin does to our fellowship and to our unity and to our worship, and how we deal with that in a way that doesn't derail the church on her journey through the wilderness of this world. That's a really big question in the book of Numbers. All right, loads going on in those first chapters, but we'll just take a break now. But as we do that, let me just say this. It's worth pointing out that as we go through this first part of the book of Numbers, generally things are really optimistic. Okay, things are good. They're going well. All right, and there's a repeated phrase through those first 10 chapters that the people of God do as the Lord commanded. So even as late as chapter 9, verse 23, you read, they obeyed the Lord's orders in accordance with his command through Moses. All right. And I think one of the biggest lessons of the book of Numbers is it's really easy to start well, and it is really difficult to finish well. All right, and we'll look at that when we come back from our break. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off. Chapter 10, things going well at Sinai. Lots of the foundational patterns and priorities of church life being built in. People knew where they were, they knew who they were, they knew what they were doing, settling into their new way of life as the people of God, learning how to worship and how to do discipleship together. Everything's getting up and running. And it's so tempting to think, brilliant, it's all working, super. What you need to realize is at this stage, everything is theoretical. Okay, so at this stage, we know how to break camp, we know how to move out, we know how to put up and take down the tabernacle in theory, but we've never had to do it yet. All right, so it's a bit like, when people, you go on a conference or a training course in something like evangelism. And you come back and it's like, yeah, I totally know what I would say to somebody who wasn't a Christian if I was talking to them about Jesus, just that I've never actually done that. All right. And it's like, there's this moment now in Numbers chapter 11 where it's like, okay, now you have to take everything you've been trained in and put that into practice. So chapter 10 and 11, it's like, we're going to take this for a test drive. Okay. It's going to be a short 3-day journey. Numbers chapter 10, verse 33. And the whole thing is we're going to practice breaking camp, setting out, journeying together, and then reestablishing the life and the worship of the camp. It's like 3 days. It's like a dress rehearsal. Like, seriously, what could go wrong? Turns out quite a lot. Okay. And we get our first insight. Numbers chapter 11, we get our first insight into 3 deeply entwined and interconnected patterns of sin that this generation never quite seems to shake off. In fact, these patterns of sin become more pronounced as the book of Numbers goes on. Okay, now the first thing is grumbling and complaining. All right, and it literally starts straight away. Numbers chapter 11, verse 1. Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. And when he heard them, his anger was aroused. And it's like, as soon as, the Lord pushes the people out from this theoretical life that they had about being church, into putting all that into practice, it's like immediately that line is crossed. The church breaks down into complaining and grumbling and discontent. And it's like, well, what's the issue here? Because we might think, well, it's not a big deal, right? There's nothing wrong really with complaining and grumbling, right? In fact, we might even think it's a good thing to blow off some steam every now and again and to get it out of your system. But actually, it's really not. The Lord takes it really seriously. Now, let's just say 2 things. The first is, let's recognize that there were hardships for the church in the book of Numbers. They're complaining about their hardships. There are hardships. All right. It is challenging to live the way to actually live the way God has called us to live, to actually do the things God has called us to do is difficult. Right. And it's challenging. And at times it's inconvenient and it requires like sacrifice. As you go through Numbers, there are times of actual hunger and thirst. There's difficulty. There's challenges that need to be overcome and changes that need to be negotiated. All right, that's true. The question is, though, when we face those challenges together as a church, what do? Do we look to the presence of the angel of the Lord in our midst and trust him and trust his goodness and his wisdom and his provision? Or do you call that goodness and wisdom into question and doubt his providence and his provision. When we face hardship, right, the church will always do one of two things. It will either worship and pray, or it will grumble and complain. And which of those responses you make will reveals a huge amount about what's going on in your heart. All right, so the first thing is to do with this grumbling, complaining, resentment that just characterizes this generation pretty much all the way through. The second thing, and again, this is linked, is that grumbling and discontent against the Lord quickly finds a focus in grumbling and being discontent and opposing the leadership, God's appointed leadership within the life of the church in Numbers. And that opposition finds expression in a number of different ways, depending on what part of what God has revealed about the life of the church that the leadership is trying to implement at any given time. Okay, and so you read, you see this a lot. Numbers chapter 12. There's opposition to Moses, and it's like the first racist incident in the life of the church, where people are complaining against Moses because he's married a woman, an amazing woman of God, who's an Ethiopian. All right, and the people are complaining about that, and it's an assault. You see, it's an assault on God's vision for the church as this glorious gathering of the people from all the nations of the world. All right. Another time, their complaining and grumbling focuses on the issue of worship. And there's a group of people who just they don't get why the church's worship has to be so prescribed. And why does it all have to focus on the high priest? And their argument in number 16 is we're all equal before in God's eyes, right? The whole community is holy. We can all approach God in our own way and express our worship of God in our own way. We can deal with God in whatever way we feel is appropriate. That just goes really, really badly, and in fact, after this moment in number 16, Korah's rebellion, there's 3 chapters of the Lord reteaching and re-emphasizing to the people the absolute necessity of relating to him through his chosen and his appointed high priest. There is no life, there is no relationship with God outside of the high priest. All right, so you've got grumbling and complaining, you've got opposition to church's leadership, and you've got, and again, this is intricately linked with the first two, but it's just a sense that the church don't really care about the future that God has called them to, the future that Christ is leading them into Canaan, and everything that's going to be teaching them and pointing them to about the new creation. All right, and right from the get-go, they just aren't that impressed, and they just want to go back to Egypt, the world, the life that they've been redeemed from. And it's like this rejection of kind of the whole of God's purpose for them as the church. It's like, I don't want to be a part of that. I want to go back to the world of sin and slavery and death. And so again, Numbers 11, we remember the fish that we ate in Egypt at no cost, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. Now we've lost our appetite and we never see anything but this manna. And it's just like, we want to go back to what we remember we enjoyed from the world that we've been redeemed from. And again, there's this really graphic kind of example of this in Numbers 13. All right, this sense of the people just not being captivated by their new creation hope. Numbers 13, it's the really famous story of sending the spies into Canaan. All right, and what God is doing with this is he's really wanting to embed their future hope, the hope he's planned for them. He wants to embed that in the psychology and in the heart of the church. So the idea is, if they send these 12 guys to explore the land of Canaan, right, they'll come back and they're like, we've been there, we've seen this, it is so great. They're going to have this really clear vision of the hope that God is calling them to and leading them to, because they've been there, and they'll be able to come back and preach that hope to the rest of the church and inspire longing and really encourage the people as they set off towards the promised land. But of course, the whole thing implodes, right? Because they come back, and what happens? Well, they all agree that the land is every bit as amazing as God said it would be. But 10 of them are like, yeah, but we don't think God can actually deliver us into that land. You know, there are huge barriers, problems, obstacles, difficulties, and like we just don't think it's ever going to happen. You know, we know what God's calling us to, but we can see all the reasons why that will never work. And Joshua and Caleb, of course, stand apart from that. And they're like, yeah, there are obstacles, there are difficulties, there are challenges, but our God is greater and he will do what he's promised. All right. And their argument isn't, oh, no, guys, it's going to be easy. Their argument isn't, there are no difficulties here. It's the problem is, yeah, there are difficulties and there are challenges, but in God and with God, we will overcome them. But it goes to a vote, doesn't it? And you have to say, on the basis of this passage, consultation and democracy, where everyone gets to have their say and then to have their vote, is not necessarily a good way to run a church. Because, of course, what the people decide is that we will give up on the future that God has called us to, and we will settle into spending the rest of our lives now wandering through the wilderness. All right. And, you know, as these sins find expression again and again in each cycle, those cycles we were talking about before the break, as each of those sins finds different expressions in these cycles, God's response, I came across this phrase that I think is really helpful. God's response is a severe mercy. All right. And there is always both discipline and grace, because that's how God, as a father, deals with his church. All right. But always the future of the church remains intact. So after this catastrophe with the spies coming back, the first thing that happens after that is God reiterates the fact that he will bring the church into the promised land. He will provide them. He will guide them. And that actually all the way through the people's kind of ambiguity and rebellion and grumbling and hostility and opposition to what God is doing, all the way through, God continues to provide for his people and to guide them. And even when they don't want the future that he's calling them into, even when they don't want the future and the life that he's redeemed them for, he just graciously keeps leading them into it and teaching them and calling them back again and again to himself and to his purposes. And I want to stress that because, again, it's so easy just to focus on, like, sometimes the really quite disturbing incidents where God is disciplining the church and to so focus on those that you miss the grace and the mercy that kind of somehow gets eclipsed by this almost voyeuristic tendency to focus in on where God is disciplining his people. So again, don't miss that as you go through the book of Numbers over the next few weeks. All right. Now, let me just say, we're almost at Numbers 26, but let me be fair to this first generation church and say that in the midst of all the ambiguity around the church's response to God's grace to them in Christ, alongside that, there is actually a growing trust in Christ. So the closer you get to Numbers 26, you begin to see the church's victories. You begin to see a bit more of the church learning how to trust the Lord, right? But within that, there are still kind of two colossal points of failure. The first is Numbers 21. I'm just flagging this up. It's the story of the bronze serpent. Yeah, and I really encourage you, when you get to Numbers 21 in about 3 or 4 weeks' time, really meditate on that story, and particularly the way Jesus uses it in John chapter 3 to say, look, yeah, this, if you understand that story, you understand me. It's really powerful stuff. But the other point of failure, and I do want to spend a bit of time on this because it's quite a complicated story, and it takes up about 15% of the book. So it's quite an important story in the book. It's the story of Balaam. All right. And it is really quite enigmatic. You know, it's the story where there's a talking donkey. And I think it's really hard to sort of sit back and go, really? You know, the only other place where I've ever seen a talking donkey is Shrek. You know, and there's this sense of, are we moving into the realm of fairy tales here? Like, how are you supposed to take this story seriously? Well, let me try and give you a bit of insight into it that might help when we get to it. All right, the story starts with the Moabites, a nation that has decided to oppose the church. And let me just say straight up, there's nothing inevitable about that decision. That is a decision that the Moabites made. All right, there were a lot of Canaanites who chose to come to Christ and to join the life of the church rather than to oppose Christ and oppose the life of the church. And you see that even in Moab, you see that there were exceptions. There were Moabites who stepped out from their nation and came to be a part of the people of God. All right. But generally, as a nation, the Moabites set themselves against the church and they want to curse it and they want to destroy it. Now, the destruction bit, that's fine. You can do that with an army, right? But cursing, now that's trickier. And this is where this guy Balaam comes in. All right. Now, it seems that Balaam is a diviner. He's called a diviner, which seems to mean that you would go to him and for a fee, Balaam would deal on your behalf with an appropriate deity. Yeah, and he would try and kind of negotiate with that deity or that spiritual reality to try to get you what you wanted. All right, so he's kind of like this dark parody, this pagan parody of the high priest. All right, so the Moabites turn up with this huge diviner's fee, and they want to deal with Israel. So what does Balaam do? Well, he's going to turn to the God, the deity, the spiritual reality that's most relevant here. And, who's the God who's most relevant to dealing with Israel? Well, it is the God of Israel. And so Balaam kind of sets out to search to encounter this God of Israel. And he must have got a real shock when the God of Israel actually turned up and started speaking to him. And the Lord's message is really simple. He said, do not curse my people. All right, that's his point. It's like, Balaam, trust me, you don't want to have anything to do with the Moabites and what they're trying to achieve here. You don't want to have anything to do with this situation. Except, of course, Balaam does want to have something to do with it because there's this massive diviner's fee that he wants to get his hands on. And so because he's just so greedy for that money, he just keeps coming back to the Lord to try to negotiate with him. Is there any way, Lord, is there any way I can get you to change your mind so that you will curse the church? And let me just say, all right, it's always a bad idea to ask Jesus to curse his bride. Yeah, that is not going to end well. And it doesn't end well for Balaam. And at the end of this negotiation period, actually, the Lord sends Balaam to his own judgment. And this is where the talking donkey comes in, because the donkey is carrying Balaam to Balaam's judgment. And he sees the angel of the Lord standing ahead with the sword ready to bring judgment on Balaam. And the donkey just sort of like stops dead in its tracks and actually sits down. He's like, I'm not going any further here. All right. And Balaam begins to beat the donkey. And the donkey turns round and talks to Balaam. And he's like, what have I done to make you beat me these 3 times? And in a way, what's even stranger is Balaam starts talking back to the donkey. And let me just say this. Don't judge the story of Balaam too harshly, because a lot of you talk to your animals even when they don't initiate the conversation. All right. So, and there is something about this, as you, a bit more seriously, as you read through the Bible, there are a number of times where animals are possessed by spiritual reality, spiritual beings. So in a way, there's nothing necessarily odd about this story. It is unique, though. It is pretty unique, even in the Bible. But actually, what's going on here? The Lord is doing something very powerful to try and turn Balaam from his path to destruction. That's what's happening. So Psalm 32, Owen used this in our worship a couple of weeks ago. Psalm 32, verse 9. Do not be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding and must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they will not come to you. All right. What's the Lord saying to Balaam here? Buddy, you're behaving like this mule. Okay. You have no understanding. And if I'm going to control you, it has to be by bit and bridle. All right. And the thing is, like, if I can put words into this donkey's mouth, then I can put words into your mouth. And that's exactly what happens every time Balaam opens his mouth to curse the church, the Lord puts words of blessing into his mouth and makes Balaam speak in a way that kind of mirrors what was going on with the donkey. And it's really interesting, just in passing, as you read the story, just ask yourself, what is this telling us about what it means for someone to be inspired by the Spirit of God to speak the word of God? All right, that's a big question. All right, and Balaam's blessing of the church, though, is amazing. All right, at the end, this is happening right at the end of this first generation's experience of church life. All right, and it's been a catastrophe in so many ways. But right at the end of this first generation's life, the Lord uses Balaam, of all people, this donkey of a man, to kind of reconfirm even now the church's hope in Christ. And when you read the blessings that Balaam pronounces over the life of the church, right, it takes them right back to Genesis 12 and the promise that the Lord made to Abraham, and it takes them right through to the coming of Christ, the one who will be the ultimate blessing for the church, and so importantly, the one who will eventually bring to an end all our cycles of sin and disobedience when he leads us into the promised land, right, into the new creation. All right, so the blessings of Balaam, again, well worth pausing and meditating on and praying over. All right, but Balaam, man, he's still, he's got his eye on this diviner's fee, and he wants that money more than he wants anything really to do, even with the living God of Israel. And so he goes back to the Moabites, and he's just like, guys, look, I just can't I can't curse the church. I'd love to, but I just can't. But I've learned enough from my dealings with the God of the church. I've learned enough to know how you can cause real problems for them with their God. And what happens is, his plan basically is, look, if spiritual attack doesn't work, then let's just go for something much more earthly and base. And under Balaam's guidance, Moab basically sends an army of prostitutes into the camp of the Lord's people to seduce them away from the living God into the worship of idols. And Balaam does that, knowing that if the church does that, the church will then have to be disciplined by the Lord. And so chapter 25, verse 3, one of the last things that is said about this first generation of the church is that they yoked themselves to the Baals. And so you have this first generation of church that started at Sinai with the golden calf and finished with the Baals. And it's a really kind of tragic story of all the mistakes that the church can make, basically. And that it leads us up to chapter 26. And chapter 26 is like the second census that is taken of the church. And it marks the coming of age of the second generation. So from Numbers 26 on, we're now dealing with a new generation of the church. And the point is that when you compare the two censi, the census at the start and the census in Numbers 26, when you compare those two chapters, right, the point is Israel hasn't grown. In fact, there's been a slight numerical decrease of about 1,800 people. All right, and the point is that God's promise to Abraham that he would bless the people and turn them into a people so great that no one could count them, right? That has been put on pause all the way through this first generation of the church. But now, and the book of Numbers changes radically in Numbers 26, because it's like this second generation are like, we have learned from the mistakes of our parents. And it's like this completely different atmosphere now, and a really deliberate turning away from all the mistakes that the first generation made, their parents made. And they are like, man, they are frighteningly focused on the promised land and all that represents. And in fact, the very first thing that we hear of this second generation are the daughters of Zelophehad, who are these amazing women. And they come to the high priest and they're like, we are totally disassociating ourselves from our parents. Yeah. And we have this like insatiable, we are so determined. We want to be in the promise. Do not deny us our inheritance in the promised land. And actually that attitude characterizes the whole generation. It's like they really want to get into Canaan now. And they are totally focused on the hope and the future that Christ has for them. And so you've got, think about the first generation's relationship with leadership. All right. Well, in the second generation, right, Joshua is commissioned for leading the people of God into the promised land. All right. And the whole thing is like, the whole thing is that they are going to be, we will follow the leadership of Joshua. You get that in Numbers. You get it as well in Joshua chapter 1, don't you? There's the whole thing where it's like, if you follow the Lord, we will follow you. And it's like, we will not be like our parents. All right. The second generation will not be like the first generation opposing leadership. We will follow you. All right. And so you got this extraordinary thing where Joshua is commissioned for leadership. And as they're getting ready to cross the Jordan under this new leadership, it's like, what are you expecting? You might be expecting, strategies, military strategies, or instructions about weapons and supplies, or how to fight, or, actually what you've got is a whole thing about worship. And again, there's this really deliberate sense of, rejecting the mistakes of their parents, and this hunger for authentic worship. We will worship in accordance with what the Lord teaches us. And so chapters 28 and 29, the Lord is like teaching them how, when they go into the land, how they are to worship. And there's this rhythm of festivals that link weekly worship to monthly worship to yearly worship, and all of it's pointing relentlessly to the church's hope in Christ. We're actually going to use those 7 festivals as our all-age summer series later this year. But it's amazing because there's this thing of, but way back in Exodus chapter 5, the whole point of the Exodus was that Moses would bring this people out of Egypt so that they could worship the Lord. And it's like, suddenly you're thinking, brilliant, this is actually going to happen. This is a people who are wanting to be a worshiping people. And there's this total rejection. And it's quite explicit when you read through Numbers. You'll see a section where they are like, we will not be idolaters like our parents. All right. Our heart is set on the worship of the living God and on that alone. And we will not be seduced into idolatry. All right. And again, chapter 33. Again, it's quite a difficult chapter to read because it's just a long list of, we journeyed to here and we camped here. We journeyed to here and we camped here. We journeyed to here and we camped here. And it's just like, oh man, this is so boring. Actually, it's not about geography. Right? It's about theology and spirituality. It's about testifying to the things that happened in those places. Yeah. One of the big problems that plagued the church through the first generation was that there was a kind of spiritual amnesia. Right? They just kept forgetting what the Lord had taught them, what the Lord had shown them, how the Lord had related to them in the past. And again, the second generation is like, well, we have this book of remembrance. We will not forget. All right. We will remember what the Lord taught us. We will remember how the Lord disciplined. We will remember how the Lord was gracious. We will remember our places of failure. We will remember the lessons that were learned in those places. And we will not make the same mistake that our parents made. All right. And so as you come to the end of the book of Numbers, you've got this new generation who've grown up, who are fiercely committed to being faithful to the Lord. And actually, it's a bit frightening. It's a bit intimidating when you read it. You've got this new generation of leaders, and you think back to the first generation, and Moses was pretty hardcore. But even within the leadership of Israel, he sort of stood apart. He stood alone. Even the leadership, people like Aaron and Miriam, there were times of really significant failure within the leadership of that first generation. But in this second generation, it's like everyone's like Moses. You've got guys like Eliezer and Joshua and Caleb. And, today we would be like, oh man, these guys are so intolerant. They're so too idealistic. They're not willing to collaborate. They're not willing to make the necessary compromises. They're not politically savvy. When you read the careers of this leadership team, you might think actually they're quite judgmental and unloving at times. But actually, it turns out that these are exactly the kind of leaders that the church needs. And it turns out that things like tolerance and inclusivity, accommodation, and compromise, when those things start to characterize the church's leadership, that begins the descent towards exile and to spiritual powerlessness and defeat in the future. And so the book of Numbers finishes actually with a mandate to the Levites. Okay, so the Levites, when we get into Canaan, this is the deal. The Levites are supposed to spread themselves out through the population as they settle into the promised land. And when you read it, you can't help but think, is this where kind of the Anglican Church got its idea of parishes from? Because it feels a lot like that. These Levites spread out through the land, and they are given this mandate. Their main job, as they live amongst the people and through all the towns of the promised land, their job is to teach the word of the Lord and to do everything they can to make sure that the people understand the word of the Lord and to make sure they obey the word of the Lord. All right. And it's like, that's our first line of defense against making the mistakes that we saw our parents make. And so there's this really fierce commitment. We want to know, that we want to be taught, we want to be held to account on making sure that as a church, we walk faithfully with the living God, because we don't want to make the mistakes that our parents made. And so you get to the very end of the book of Numbers, and the whole thing is that the church has already begun under the second generation. The church is, and as the first generation began to learn some of its lessons, the church has begun to inherit just the fringes of the promised land. But as you come to the end of the book of Numbers, they're positioned across the Jordan from Jericho, and the stage is set for the book of Joshua, which chronologically Joshua follows on straight from Numbers. All right. And so we get to the end. We're ready for the book of Joshua with everything that's going to teach us. But the question that hangs over the book, as we come to a close, the question that hangs over the book is the question that we started with an hour ago. All right. Remember what Paul taught us about this book. It's not just there for our intellectual curiosity. It's not just there for our sense of history. It's there to teach us about what it means to be church. And it's there to teach us about what it means to be the people of God, how to live as the people of God, and how not to live as the people of God. And as we go through the book as part of our read through this year, have that question hanging over us. Will we learn from their example? Will we heed the warnings? And there are a lot of warnings. Will we heed the warnings of this book? And I think if you have that question as you read through the book of Numbers, it will just help you navigate and make sense of it. So it's a great book. Like I said before we started recording, it's a book I've really fallen in love with over the last couple of weeks, kind of getting ready for this morning. And, I really hope you enjoy it. And I hope it's a book that you experience the Lord speaking to you through and envisioning and re-envisioning and re-exciting us about being part of the church and about the hope and the life that he has called us to and sets before us. All right. And the big lesson, I think, is that the Lord remains faithful to his people, even when his people are not faithful to him. So it's a really encouraging book to read. And I hope you enjoy it as well as learn from it. Okay, that's it. We're done. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Hey.
Thank you.
Super.